So now let's take a look how we can use the same method to control the bump, so that we can have a bump map showing on one side and another bump map showing on the other. Once again, keeping in mind that it does change depending on the side of the plant that it's showing on. So it is somewhat limited, but we'll go ahead and set that up the way it was before and see if we can at least achieve the basic setting. So we'll open up the material, select the bump, and we're going to create another combiner node, having it set to blender. And we'll go ahead and connect the other input. We might need to reverse those, but I do believe we had a stronger amount on the bottom before. I am going to connect the ratio of the blender. And I didn't mention this before, but in case those links aren't showing up on the side of the node that I'm grabbing to connect, up at the top, you can choose whether or not to show them. Otherwise, what you can do is just extract that amount. So we'll connect that to that floor that we had before, and what I'm going to do is select projected texture map and create another one. And then we can connect the other input of the blender to that image map and add in a filter. So one thing we could do is just, using a standard filter, drag down that right side to decrease the intensity. So we can see it's a very small amount. And our depth we'll go ahead and set up to 0.5, which is what it was originally set to. And if we take a look at the preview, you can see it very intense on the bottom and very light amount on the top. And so far, it appears to be working correctly. There doesn't appear to be any leaves that have any issues, because it is strange how it works. Really, it's more of the intensity may show correctly on the underside of the leaf, where we can see it a little more pixelated. It's obviously more intense, but what may or may not happen is there might be a reversal of the output. So although the bump amount will be correct, the image map may not be, or whatever it is you're using to control it. But for the most part, we still are achieving the same effect. So same as the mixed material, it's also going to have these same issues, although it does do kind of a strange reversal. Something I haven't really duplicated within the simple material, although it's not necessarily a bad thing, considering that it appears to be more of a bug. So before I work anymore with this bump map, I need to correct it. It's far too pixelated, not enough resolution. So we are going to edit that. And what we can do is go to the Links tab. And if we want, we can scale up these images. And we can see all of the texture maps in the scene. This includes ecosystems as well. It's a great way to modify plants and edit materials of any sort of ecosystem or anything in the scene. It also allows us to export any embedded images. If we go to the lower right, you can see that it is incorporated because it is part of the plant. And if we right mouse click, we can set up a couple of different options. There's an incorporated. We can synchronize it, set it to locked. You can replace the link, so we could load in another image without even having to go into the material editor. We can replace the map, which is what we're going to do in a minute, and then export the link and reload the link. So if you updated the file but it's not updating in view, you can reload that link. But what we want to choose is export link. And now I just have a folder I called links, and what we can see is the name of the original file. We also have the ability to save this in whatever format we want, which will automatically convert it from, in this case, it's a GIF. But if we want to use another format, we can choose any available export format in view and save it out. Since the GIF is an indexed file, indexed color type, so it was a bitmap when in grayscale mode. But bitmap's going to be a little bit better, it doesn't have the compression. So we'll go ahead and just save it as a bitmap to start. And I'm going to open that up in Photoshop, and we can see that the scale of the image is ridiculously low. Not something that's going to work for a close-up. From far away, it's just fine. If the bump's too high, you might have some flickering from it. And really, the image scale doesn't seem to affect renders all that much if you're using MIP mapping. Just the memory requirement of the scene. So I typically like to work with very large images. We can see the height is 512, and our width is only 243. This is a very, very low resolution image. So before I make any scale changes, because we are in index mode, it'll look like crap if I scale it up like this. I'm going to select Control A to select all, or we can go to up to the top, select and all, Control C to copy, Control N for new, and it's automatically going to take that selected size from the clipboard and set up our document scale. I'm going to change our color mode to grayscale and our bit depth to 16-bit. I'm also working with transparent background and having it show as white. If you go to Edit Preferences, you can go to the transparency, and I have my grid turned off, so it's just going to show as white. Then we can go ahead and just paste that into the new document, and now we can set up our resampling. If I go back, I'm using a shortcut of Control K, which brings up preferences straight to general. Very, very useful shortcut because it allows you to change your image interpolation very quickly and very easily without having to go to Edit Preferences every single time. Because you will find that you do need to change your interpolation types frequently when you're scaling, sizing down images, because a fixed mode isn't always going to work. I usually stick it with bilinear, which isn't the default. But right now we're not really going to have to worry about that because we're going to be using the image size option. So if we go up to top, image size, we can choose the interpolation type, which has to do with the resampling. So I'm going to start out by increasing the scale of this. Let's take the percentage and bring it up to 400%. And then if we go back to the image size, we can take a look and see you now have 2048 by 972. This might be a little large, depending on the type of scene you're working on, but I want to get close to the leaves, so I want to have the detail that I'm going to need. Now, just resizing this is not going to fix any of our problems. The biggest problem is the transition between different color zones. This is not smooth enough to work as a proper bump. It's far too grainy and has some issues. There's also the fact that it was an 8-bit indexed image to begin with, so it's not really 16-bit. We're going to save it in a 16-bit format, but if you take a look Control L pulls up levels. We can see the histogram. And you can see all of this detail on the right. It's not even part of it. So what I want to do is just kind of adjust these levels a little to bring it in more. The auto mode might also work. In this case, we have some values that are going to be clamped out. So we'll just bring in that right slider slightly and the left one in a little. Click OK. And that's a good starting point. Now we also need to pay attention to the edge. Really depending on how the transparency map works, we might even just create a new one. Because the PNG files work best for just about everything. Stay away from JPEG if you can. Pretty important. Okay, so what I'm going to start with here is taking care of the grain. There's two primary filters I'm going to be using. If I go to Filter and Noise, we have the Reduce Noise filter and Blur, Surface Blur. These two are great for smoothing out images, but preserving a lot of the detail in some of the sharper areas and not completely losing everything. So I'm going to start with the Reduce Noise. Excessive amounts of reduced noise will create some problems. If you take a look where I have preserved details, once we fall below usually 2 or 3%, we start to really oversample the image more than we need to. It creates more of a blur than just a noise reduction. In this case, you want to make sure that Sharpen Details is turned off, 0%. Preserve Details, I typically never go under 3 unless it's really, really bad. In this case, I've seen worse. So I'm going to start with 3%. Click OK. And also that Remove JPEG artifact, don't use that. Even when you're working with the JPEG that has a lot of artifacts, they actually just get worse with Reduce Noise option for the Remove artifact. And the more times you run the filter, it just keeps removing that, because really a JPEG artifact, it scales differently, and it really depends on the size of the image, so it's not always going to work. So now that we've reduced the noise, we're going to use a Surface Blur. Now you can see this really, really gives us a nice, smooth transition, and gets rid of a lot of the really harsh levels and plateaus that we have, which is creating the majority of the pixelation. So you can adjust the threshold amount, bring it down really low. We're going to see basically this is what the bump is looking like when we're rendering. We have these very harsh cutoffs and plateaus between the color gradients. So the threshold is the level we want to remove, and then the radius is the total amount of blur. So you can usually turn this up pretty high. A lot of the fine details and those thin lines, well, those are also part of the color map. So we may not need to even have those in the bump, because really they end up requiring more anti-aliasing and higher render quality settings in order to really extract that detail, where you can typically achieve the same effect just by keeping the color map there. And giving the overall depth to the leaf can be more important than the tiny details. In a highlight map, you can usually get away with a lot more, so that's something you could also do with the highlight map. So we'll go ahead and run that. And anytime I do a surface blur, I always reduce noise again. Same settings as before. Now there are some issues by the stem, and if you hit Control F, it'll rerun the reduce noise. But one thing you want to pay attention to is this edge. Now, every single time we're running these filters, it is blurring the edge. Now, depending on how the clip map was created, we might have the black showing up inside of the transparency, or not being clipped out by the transparency. Now, for this center and the stem, the way it is creating this fine line, which you might not be able to see, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little. And if we take a look and we can see any sort of gradient, or really see harsh pixels, we might need to modify the levels a little bit more and adjust the color balance to get rid of a lot of that without really peaking any of the white points. And then I'm going to rerun the reduce noise. And I think possibly in this case, since I am going to create a new clip map, I'm going to go into the noise, reduce it, and preserve details set to 0. Strength I also have set to 10. You can use lower amounts. Since this was originally a GIF, I'm really going to be using this filter a lot. So you just want to make sure that you don't use it too much, because sometimes you can end up with some sharp edges. So around that stem now, what I'm going to do is just use a blur and kind of manually go in and just blur that. Because we're essentially just blurring everything. If there's any problematic areas where you really see too much of the plateau, not a smooth gradient, and you're seeing more of that solarized look, then you might want to just blur it. And you might even be able to get away with running a Gaussian blur on the entire surface. So if we take a look, we're seeing it almost looks like wood, and that's going to cause a lot of issues. So we're going to go back and we're going to select a Gaussian blur and see if that is going to correct it. It's probably mainly because of the original image it's coming from, and also just the overall depth. It could also be part of a preview error. I'm going to go ahead and adjust the levels a little. I'm going to reduce noise once again, and that should be good for this bump map. If we really have to, I mean, we can make some more modifications to try to eliminate some of those errors. But in this case, I mean, we started with such a low resolution image, it might be difficult to completely get rid of it. We could also bring it up a little higher, make it a lighter tone. So we'll just see how this looks. But for the most part, we do have some of these areas. So I am going to go back and just kind of tweak that a little. We'll pull it up, try to get rid of most of that, not darken it too much. And I'm going to go ahead and save this out. So I'm going to save it as PNG file. I'm just going to call it rubber bump. Not going to interlace. And we'll also be generating a new alpha just in case that edge needs to be brought in. So that's pretty quick. Easy, we could just make a copy just to preserve that layer. I'm going to move over to the quick selection tool. Increase the scale. And just go ahead and grab the black areas on the outside. And we might as well clip out that little part of the plant that sticks out. When you're using this tool, you also want to right click and go to Refine Edge. And this way you can adjust the smoothness and really modify the alpha. If you need to see a comparison, normally that second with the red background will allow you to see it with the bump. And this way we can assure that we're not going to have a really harsh fall off around the edge unless it's something you want. Mainly we just want to get rid of any sort of flat surface that would happen. If we were getting directly into the black, you're just going to see it cut off and then smooth out. And that's not what we need for the bump. So the settings I have right now are going to work pretty well. 4.3 pixels for the radius, 92% contrast, 86% smoothing, 1.2 pixels for the feather. A slight bit of feather. Works quite well with a PNG file. And then you can contract or expand the selection. Now the bigger the image, the longer this is going to take to process the refine edge. So making huge changes in contract and expand with a really large image can sometimes take a while to refresh. Now I do want to bring this back to the expand, because we're going into the leaf. And we just take a look around that edge. That should be good. So now what I can do is create a new layer. And I'm going to use the paint bucket tool, click the reset button just underneath the two palette colors, and if I go ahead and just click in there, since the selection was on the outside, it's filling in the outside, not the inside. So we do kind of have a reversed fill there. So I'm going to undo, right click. We can select the marquee tool or hit M on the keyboard, right click, select inverse. So that's going to select the inside. We're going to paint that black in the center because that's what we want to stay. And now we can see the edge that is showing and how much we're really clipping this in. Add a new layer. Swap our colors to white. Hit M on the keyboard or the marquee tool, and you could just pretty much click anywhere just once. Just kind of a tap click. That'll deselect, and then you can paint in that white color. And now we have a new transparency map. This does not need to be 16-bit. That's just going to take up more file size than is needed. I'm going to select both of these layers and just hit Control E. And then create a new document from the current state. So we can go to History, and the first button that we have in the bottom will create a new document. Change our mode to 8-bit. And now we can save this out as another PNG file. So we'll call this clip or transparency. I'm going to turn off, we do not want to use any sort of color profiling. We do not want layers incorporated. Of course, with a PNG file, since I have to change it first because we had a Photoshop, most of those options aren't available. Save it out, not going to interlace it. And I also want to note that the grayscale 16-bit images and the larger ones can take a little longer to save out. So just give them a chance to save. The file sizes are greatly lower than something like a TIFF, although EXR is a pretty nice format, but it's 32-bit typically. We're going to go back into view, and we're in that links tab again, and what we can do is just update these two images. So we can right click and go to replace link, and now we can see the original file and then the new clip, and we'll go to the bump and replace that link with that bump we created. So now we have something that's going to look much better, and we should see far less of that grainy, overpixelated look where the high amounts of bump exist. So I'll just go ahead and zoom in here. And I also, one thing I'd like to do while I'm editing plants is turn off the wind and breeze effects. Of course, it's mainly just the breeze, because wind is either manual controlled operation or affected by a ventilator. The breeze is just a global option. I don't want these plants moving or being affected by the wind and breeze, and you can see that did modify the way the leaves look as well. So coming in here, we can see that we have this lighter edge around the leaf, and that is part of the color map. We could clip that in a little bit more if needed, or we could also modify the color. For now, I'm just going to keep that the way it is. Some of the grain we're seeing from the bump is primarily going to be because of the ambient light that is associated with this. Because typically the bump's going to work a little bit better on top. We're going to go to the material. And let's just go ahead and turn that up to 2. See what happens. It's also because we're just rendering in the preview mode. So it is going to end up looking better overall, at least in the long run. And certainly better than using a GIF. The only thing is it really just increases the memory requirement of the scene, which overall it really isn't all that high. And another thing to keep in mind is the color map is also just as gritty and grainy, which is still part of the image, so it will have those effects too. Whether or not you want to modify that leaf, up to you. I'm just going to keep this the same for now. What we're going to do is just build a metanode we can use to repeat this operation for customizing our plans. So we don't have to worry about setting up all of those nodes for every single material we want to modify. So we're going to select that material, edit the function, and let's go ahead and make a metanode. What we need are a couple of different things. One thing that will need to be done is kind of organizing this a little bit and figuring out where we're going to be placing certain operations, whether or not we want the influence to be permanently controlled by slope or leave it open. And whether or not we want to embed filters. I think I'm pretty much going to keep that all open. So what we'll do is just set up these couple of nodes here. Go ahead and select them. And then we can create Metanode. Double click to open up the Metanode. And now we can see we have a color output. And it did reset my entire interface here. So I'll just go ahead and reorganize that. And now we do need to pay attention to the placement of things and which inputs are controlling what part of the leaf without modifying the slope or whatever the main influence is in this case. I mean, if we're using something other than slope, then that's really going to change. But we can see the filter is, of course, the top leaf. So if we go into the Metanode and take a look at our double input nodes that are automatically created, and now these are supposed to be pretty much on top and aligned as part of the top group. Instead, they've been separated. That might be a problem with the new version. Typically, they'll all be aligned on top. These are input nodes. You can right-click, go to Add Input. There's a color input node, which is what the projected texture and perspective are, and then double input is going to be a numeric input, the numbers. So we filter, So we're going to say for the slope, we're going to call this dual control. So whatever we want to influence the separation between the surfaces. This filter is going to be the top. We'll just call it top. The projected was going to the bottom. So this projected texture map that we had is going to be for the color. We also want to specify and name it color if we wanted to. Since the link itself is going to be a different color, it's green rather than blue. It's a little easier to separate, so you could also call those top and bottom. I'm just going to do C, a small c, to represent the color. And then the projected was the top, because that was just the base image, and the perspective is what we had, the color perspective, so C, bottom. Whether or not you want these controls to be extracted, the main thing you'd want to pull out would be basically the threshold, transition. If you have kind of a fixed value you want to stick with, or we could set that threshold to 0. I am going to publish the transition. So we'll call this group blend, or we'll call it mix blend and smoothing for the name of the actual control. So that is our transition amount. You could also just keep it named transition. So now we can adjust that blend directly in here without having to make any other changes. And whenever we want to reload this into anything else, we can just connect everything to this node and not have to set anything else up. There is an automatic control you could do for the bump if you wanted to have a reverse output, creating sort of an auto mode. So if you wanted to have this bump map show, and we'll go ahead and change the preview. On the bottom, you wanted to have this one, and then on top, you wanted it, let's say, inverted. One thing you could do, which is kind of neat, is if we go to Edit the Metanode, we're going to go ahead and set this up to create an auto blend. So we're going to add in a blender, connect this output to the bump, to the new blender, input 0, which is going to be the first input on the left. First input is always input 0, second is input 1, so on. Always starts with 0. Even so, though with the combiner nodes, it might show as input 1, 2. So you just pay attention. If you hover over the link, it'll tell you which one you're working with. This is going to be our auto switch mode, saying whether or not we want to use the auto. Setting it to 0 is going to turn off the auto mode. And actually, I do want to replace this with, or not replace, but instead move this above, because otherwise it will not work. So let's reconnect that main link to the blender, and we really only want to adjust the bottom, whether or not it switches. Okay, so if we're going to use the auto mode, so let's say we move the slider all the way to 1, we're saying use the auto mode. So in that case, we would take input 1, select that top input, and all we need to do is select that line, add in a filter, and set it to invert, or opposite, which would cause an inversion. And the input 0 to the bottom, so if it's all on the left, off, it's going to use that bottom input. So this way, if you want to do something really quickly, you only need to select one map. So let's publish this as auto bump. And really, it can be any numeric control. It doesn't have to be the bump. So right now what it's doing is using the inverted top image, which is actually over here, the filter. So it's just going to invert that. I'm going to remove the filter, and what we can do is actually just delete the other image since we have it set to auto. So now the bottom will be an inverted version of what is on top. And this is also only going to require just one connection to the texture. And if you decide you want the reversal of the image maps, and say maybe, well, the one that's on top I actually want on bottom, all you need to do is just reverse that main image, and it'll automatically reverse when you have the auto bump on. And then if you decide you want to use a separate image, you can turn off that auto mode and connect that bottom to whichever map you want to be the bottom. So this creates a fairly nice little node. And I like to call it top and bottom. And that's technically primarily if you're working with slope. In this case we are. I'm including this node, of course, with the training. It is also going to become part of Snowflake in the next update. Something a little more advanced and some more options with it, though. So let's turn back on the auto mode, and we can save this out. You can give it a version number if you want in the details. Actually, this would be our point 1 rather than version 1. And I want to note that if you want to very quickly and easily access this node, instead of having to right-click Load Metanode or go over to the left and select the Load Metanode button, the way I have my interface set up, if we take a look, underneath any of these available types of nodes, textures, input, output, noise, any of them, there's also a Metanode folder that shows up. Now, not every single one is going to have the Metanode folder by default. You have to create it. But basically, it's part of your content installation. So we'll take a look at that really quick. So this is my native application content folder, basically my install folder. I don't save anything into it, just in case when I'm updating a view, which sometimes it will delete files that are in your content directory. So I have a separate folder and a drive for all of that content, and then the native stuff, the stuff that installs with Vue, comes with it. That's all different. Now, the metanodes are different just because it's the only way to access, but I do have duplicate copies. Always a good idea to save those out if you have something a little more complex. But within the metanodes folder of the installation, so Vue 7-5 is what I have as my content folder, and within the metanodes folder of that, we can see a name for each group. Now I'm going to go back. There was one of these that did not have a metanode, and that would be the constant. So what we could do is I've already created a folder called constant, but since there's nothing in it, what's going to happen is nothing is going to show. So once we move something into it, let's just move my Coral Loom metanode in there. So we got a constant, and now metanodes Coral Loom. So anything you move into a folder with the name of that type of node is going to show up. So if we wanted our top and bottom, which is technically kind of a combiner node, what I could do is save that out, which I already did. I'll have to load that in. And I've called it top and bottom, and this is the training version since I have a different version that I work with. So this is a combiner, and I can move it into the combiner folder. If these folders are not created, all you have to do is make them. I know that the dynamics one is not there, input. Some of these folders are not pre-generated, so you might just need to create it, name it, and then it'll show up in view. So now we can go to our combiner, metanodes, and we see top and bottom showing up. Very quick way to access these customizable commands.